Hey, brother. I'm so sorry about that.
It's okay. No
was driving
worries.
something and I just realized it was
No,
9:08.
no problem. I just want to make sure that I'm recording. Yep, I'm recording. Good to see you, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing okay as well as we can do in these times. How
Yeah.
about you?
Well, yeah, the same. The same. You know, I can't remember the last time we spoke, but you had been to Lebanon,
Hmm.
and your posts were rather prophetic, I would say, in the sense that we're seeing this pretty horrific escalation of the war in southern Lebanon, and I guess I'd like you to talk a bit about that. And before I even go too much further, I also want to commend you on the incredible work that you've been doing to keep us informed, because, uh, as you're fully aware of, the security state is constantly clamping down on YouTubers and people that are sharing the truth as opposed to the endless um, media manipulations of the conflict in Gaza. So,
Hmm.
yeah, just talk a little bit about where we're at now in Lebanon compared to when you were there, however long ago, it was 6 months, something like that. Pardon me.
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words and the feelings mutual. You devoted your life, as seems, to the cause of justice and to truth telling. And, Malcolm, that's why I always enjoy appearing on your show.
Yeah,
It's a privilege
same,
to talk.
same with you, my friend.
So, uh, look, where do we begin? I mean, I think the writing was on the wall very early on in this conflict because, um, for several reasons, that we were headed towards a major war. Uh, I've always hoped that I was wrong, and I still hope that I'm wrong.
Oh,
But everything I've seen over the past few weeks fortifies me in my conclusion that that's exactly where we're heading. And there are a few factors at work here. One is that, um, first of all, Israel's government has received an unequivocal message from its primary backers in the West, and that is there's nothing it can do, literally nothing, that will cause them to stop arming Israel. If they aren't willing to stop arming Israel after the horrors we've witnessed in Gaza and beyond, and now switching to the West Bank and South Lebanon, why would they stop Israel now? So that's the message I think that the leadership of Israel has received, and they are acting accordingly. Secondly, we know from history that Israel will not brook any opposition, effective opposition, particularly to its dominance of the region. And it is an arm of US dominance. That's why the US arms it ultimately. And, these resistance groups are doing great damage to this aura of invincibility that Israel has carefully cultivated over the decades. That aura of invincibility, I think, serves basically two functions from the perspective of the Israeli leadership. The one is to deter disobedience amongst actors in West Asia. But I think even more important to the Israeli leadership is that there is this demographic war, which they have talked about for decades, in order for them to have a Jewish Israeli population that outnumbers the indigenous Palestinian population. They need to convince the Jewish Israelis who are there already that they are protected from the consequences of the Israeli government's aggression. And they need to convince Jewish people living in the diaspora who have, a Zionist orientation that Israel might be a place where they want to emigrate to. That's how they can, hold their own in the demographic war. And the demographic war is important for a variety of reasons. One of which is you can't, you need to have a certain size of population in order to control the indigenous Palestinian population. The smaller the Israeli Jewish population becomes, the more difficult that task is. So, um, because of these two factors, and because they've been given the green light to do anything, I think it was inevitable that they were going to turn their attention to these other resistance groups outside of historic Palestine and begin to apply the same methods to them that they have been applying to the Palestinians in Gaza. That's exactly what we're seeing. And, hundreds of people, overwhelmingly civilians, if not all civilians, in the last 48 hours have been massacred by Israeli strikes. When Israel says, I follow assiduously, more than is good for my health, the Israeli press, what it's
Mm.
saying about this. I also follow very carefully what the resistance groups are saying. They put out dozens of statements a day, and you can access them unedited so far on Telegram. So I devote 1 or 2 hours a day to doing that. And uh, what we're hearing on both sides is that, well, the Israelis, they claim when they launch these deadly attacks that they're escalating, that they're destroying hundreds of launchers. That's what they say, missile launchers. I can tell you, Malcolm, I've been to South Lebanon 5 times
Mm.
in in last year, and I toured the entirety of South Lebanon, from the Mediterranean coast to the area that's just south of the Bekaa Valley. I've been on the highest mountain in South Lebanon, Safi, which has a panoramic view of all of South Lebanon, and including parts of northern Israel on a clear day. I've been 1 kilometer from the Israeli border within eyesight of numerous Israeli military bases. I have never seen a single missile launcher,
Mm.
not one, not one. How they are able to destroy hundreds of them in a single, bombardment is, I mean, it's preposterous. They're not bombing missile launchers. The missile launchers are nowhere to be seen. They are either very well camouflaged or they're underground and they come up, you know, briefly from tunnels and they fire, or they might remain permanently in the tunnels and they're coming out through silos. Apparently, they're now fighting missiles, the resistance, in that manner. So they're claiming to be destroying missile launchers and also other types of military infrastructure. But I've actually seen, it's not just that I haven't seen any launchers. I've gone to various sites where they've demolished buildings, and there was absolutely no evidence that any of these buildings served a military function. They looked very much like apartment blocks, hair shops, auto repair shops. So I think that they're just doing what they've always done, which is terrorizing the civilian population in the hope that they will force Hezbollah to capitulate. And just as Hamas has not capitulated after they've carpet bombed Gaza for a year, Hezbollah is not going to capitulate, no matter what suffering they impose on the civilian population. And I don't think that's because Hezbollah is evil. I think that's because they understand that if they don't take a stand now, they'll have to endure this for the rest of their lives.
Mm.
Constant Israeli aggression. And now they're talking openly. Today, there was just a statement by a minister in the Netanyahu government about expanding Israel and confiscating South Lebanon, as they've done to the Golan Heights effectively, as they've done effectively to the West Bank. The most extreme members of the Israeli cabinet, who are becoming increasingly powerful, have a vision of a greater Israel. They will not stop if they ethnically cleanse Palestine. They're going to come after Lebanon. They're going to come after Jordan. They're going to come after other parts of Syria. That is the inevitable consequence of this impunity. And people there understand this. And so they view this as the ultimate battle.
Mm.
They're not going to capitulate. This is the war that they must fight to the death in order to bring to an end this domination once and for all. So it's just such an explosive mix, and it only leads to one place, and that is a major regional war.
What do you say to the often repeated statement from both mainstream media and independent media that essentially what Israel has been doing and continuously tries to do is to bait America primarily into a war with Iran, like a wider conflict, and that there's some kind of um, push pull there, even going on between the American administration and the Israeli government.
Mhm. It's complicated because the American, no government is monolithic, and that's absolutely true, I think, of the American government. So I think there are almost certainly people in the American government, probably most of them are in the Pentagon, who understand that where this is heading is an absolute disaster. There are probably people, on the economic side in the Biden administration who understand that if this blows up to a full-blown war, the price of oil is going to go through the roof, and the global economy, including the U.S. economy, are going to suffer severe damage. Um, but then there are people like Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland who want to finish off all resistance to Western hegemony in West Asia once and for all. And they're willing to risk everything in order to do that, even potentially nuclear war. So I think what we're witnessing is a push and a pull,
Mm.
uh, and a lot of tension growing within the US government. And what I think Netanyahu and his ilk are trying to do is they're trying to make it easy for their allies in the US government to prevail in this debate. The way you do that is you get Hezbollah to inflict large-scale civilian casualties on Israel. You get Hezbollah to, attack the center of Haifa with heavy missiles and cause hundreds of casualties. And you may think, well, really, would the Israeli administration, the government of Netanyahu, cause Hezbollah to kill civilians? Well, they killed their own civilians when the fighters the Palestinian militants were trying to take hostages back into Gaza. The Israeli media has covered this.
Uh,
The Western media are now admitting it. So sure, yeah, they don't mind sacrificing hundreds or even thousands of their own citizens to achieve their larger objectives. So I think they're trying to provoke an overreaction from Hezbollah, and then people like Victoria Nuland and Antony Blinken and Sullivan will go to the Pentagon and say uh, it's do or die for Israel. They're massacring civilians en masse. We must come in with full force to defend Israel. That's, I think, the game that's being played.
yeah. Well, it's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't for not only Hezbollah, but any other forms of resistance, because obviously you can't just, I mean, I preach and profess nonviolence as often as possible, but I've also been reading some articles, scholarly works about the issue of violence, particularly pertaining to people like Che Guevara, who was a trained doctor who took the Hippocratic Oath, but ended up, it's not an exaggeration that he himself killed people and used violence to achieve a certain type of change that would have not happened otherwise. I mean, there's no way the Cuban Revolution could have happened without some elements of violence, of course. But so I guess what I'm sort of saying is, how do you see, for example, Nasrallah, right? He's the the main leader of Hezbollah. How would you see them responding? Do you think that they would be measured, or you think they're just going to kind of go all out? And I mean, Nasrallah just declared war, literally, almost. He might as well have done so the other day. So
Yeah, well, I think he said that the pager and walkie-talkie attack, which is Leon Panetta, the former CIA chief, acknowledged is terrorism,
right.
that was a declaration of war on them, um, on the Lebanese. Uh, I would be very surprised if you see that kind of a reaction. So where they just, basically lay waste to a city like Haifa, causing large-scale civilian casualties. It may come to that eventually, but I think they're going to try to avoid that at all costs.
Mm.
Not at all costs, but as long as they feel they possibly can. And so, for example, they have, within the last 48 hours, it's very clear, even the Israeli media acknowledges this, the Islamic resistance is attacking well beyond the 20-kilometer envelope that they confine themselves to in northern Israel. They've gone at least 65 kilometers in. They've attacked repeatedly in the last 48 hours or 72 hours the Ramat David Air Base, which is well beyond the 20-kilometer range. They've attacked Rafael production facilities. This is the military contractor in Israel that produces the air defense systems, amongst other military technologies. I've seen reports that missiles landed outside of Tel Aviv. I've seen no reports that they've actually struck the center or, the heavily populated areas of either Haifa or Tel Aviv. I think they've struck the outskirts because they're sending a message. We can strike your major cities.
Mm.
We have the capacity to penetrate your air defenses, and we're warning you. So pull back from the precipice. And there's no indication that Israel's going to do that. So what's next? I don't know. I mean, at some point, if they keep killing hundreds and hundreds of Lebanese civilians, I certainly don't encourage this on anybody's part. I object to the targeting of any civilian uh, population centers or infrastructure. But I think based upon, you hear the language coming from Hezbollah from time to time, an eye for an eye. And if they feel that Israel is determined to massacre as many Lebanese civilians as it can, then we may well see a heavy, bloody attack on one or more major population centers in Israel. And I think this will be a massive shock to the people of Israel. It'll be something they've never experienced before.
Mhm. I think it was after the last time we spoke. I it's an odd kind of connection, but a number of years ago, I worked with a young musician from Toronto named Evan Malach, who uh, is Jewish Canadian. I mean, Canadian Jewish slash, uh, and his uncle, his father's brother, had moved to Israel back in the early '80s to get involved in some tech type work there, that startup kind of thing. Ended up getting a piece of land with an olive farm, and now has an olive production company. And he's located in Tiberias, which is near the Sea of Galilee. And that's one of the affected areas where people have been evacuated from, and they're living in hotels and so forth. My point is that the conversations that I have had with him, both through Zoom, I interviewed him on my show, but also, our back and forth emails, there's such a parallel universe. That's the only way. It's very like a science fiction movie. Like, his view of the motives of Israel, of the victimhood of Israel, of the interpretations of even the most recent pager attacks and so forth, is so remote, from my point of view, so remote from reality that it's almost fantastic. Like, it's just like a living LSD trip, or a bad LSD trip to listen to this guy talk. But the point I'm getting at is that there is this justification that, particularly amongst the settlers in Israel, really do feel that this is an existential conflict, that they are under threat, that if they don't strike and strike hard, Israel will be annihilated. And it's
Mhm.
this constant sense of, but it's rooted in, it has biblical origins. It's not just politics for these guys.
Yeah.
It's actually, we've interpreted the Bible and the words of Abraham and Isaac and Joseph, Jacob, and there's this sense that this is a manifestation of a biblical prophecy.
Hmm.
And it just seems so hard to get around that. Like, there's a dead end in that conversation for me.
Yeah. I think that's certainly a factor, but there are secular Israeli Jews who are also equally committed to the government's tactics and supportive of the government's tactics. So it's also, I think, just lifelong brainwashing, frankly. Malcolm, I went to Israel in 2016. Last time I went was in March of this year. In 2016, I was in Tel Aviv, and to do legal work. I wasn't there relating to the Palestinian cause. I had to interview some witnesses for a class action, some Eritreans who were in Tel Aviv. And I go to the gym every day, and you get on your treadmill, and oftentimes you'll see like this whole bank of television sets.
Mm-hmm.
There were like 6 or 7 television sets in front of the treadmill I was on, and every single one of them had a Hamas fighter on them, and they were all wearing black masks, and they all had a machine. It was wild. I couldn't believe it. It was like 24/7. Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. They're evil. They want to kill us all, and so forth.
Right.
So there's a tremendous amount of indoctrination going on, and there is, a lot of biblical fervor as well. And I think obviously there's this misinterpretation of my view. I mean, I'm not a religious man, but I think there's a lot of distortion of what the Bible actually says. The thing is, Malcolm, on the other side, you also have a tremendous amount of religious faith entering into the equation. I went to three funerals of Hezbollah fighters over the past year. Um, it wasn't the kind of, there wasn't like wild expressions of revenge coming from the people. There was just a kind of um, solemn belief that this was um, their sacred duty. And if they had to sacrifice themselves, it was almost a view that they expressed oftentimes when I was there. And you'll see this in their communications from the resistance groups. They're honored to die in the cause of justice, and they view this as being a cause of justice. They view that as a privilege, many of the Shia who are fighting in the South. So again, this is a very, very explosive combination. You have, uh, profoundly felt religious belief on both sides. You have a green light being given by the US government, an unlimited supply of weapons. And you have capabilities on the resistance side that they never previously possessed, particularly missile technologies they never previously possessed. I mean, Ansar Allah just struck Israel with what appears to have been a hypersonic missile. It penetrated all of the air defenses and struck near Tel Aviv. Yeah, I just don't see how we avoid a conflagration unlike any we've seen in the Middle East. And this will end in Israel's destruction. That's exactly where this is heading.
Well,
I've
many
said
have
repeatedly.
said that. Yeah, there are many. I've spoken to, for example, Chris Hedges and a few other people, and Norman Finkelstein. They all see this as the demise of Israel ultimately, because, and I'll tell you why. An interesting point I think it was Chris made. Every country needs its mythology. America's got its myth, right? Freedom, shackles of colonialism, blah blah blah. This kind of thing. Um, Israel has, for a very long time, had this myth of the little guy in the midst of all this hostility. And I mean, who can forget the movie Exodus? Paul Newman. Like the portrayal of these brave people struggling for freedom after being, through the Holocaust and everything else. That myth is gone. I think the whole world sees that myth no longer exists. And so without a myth, I believe a country can't function. I think it will just, it's going to fall. Sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
mean to philosophize or over analyze things, but go ahead. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, and when it falls, what's going to happen? I believe, and I've said, this several times in the past year, the way I see this playing out is that Israel will lose the demographic war.
Right.
When people are waking up to the reality that Israel cannot uh, engage in unlimited brutality and protect the civilian population from the consequences of its brutality. They're seeing this. It doesn't matter how much people lie to you, but when you see, missiles falling in your community, you see buildings burning in your community, you see the sirens going off 5 times a day, forcing you and your children to run into a bunker. No amount of Israeli propaganda is going to conceal the fact that you're vulnerable, that you're at risk. So, and this is what's happening in Israel in the north right now, and it's going to go, cover the whole of the country soon if we continue down this path. So, what are the people going to do? If you have the option of leaving, you're going to leave, and if you had been contemplating moving there, you're not going to go.
Tourism is like that. I mean, economically speaking, this is already a disaster economically for Israel. Look, there are people, and I've had a rabbi by the name of David Feldman. He's from, the New York area. He's an Orthodox rabbi, Jew, and he wears a kiffiyeh, and he gets up there with the, free Gaza protesters and people are like, why is, how is this guy? But he said to me on in the interview, he said, as a Jew, the last place I would want to live is Israel. Why would I want to live somewhere where everybody has guns and you're constantly worried about this, that, and the other thing? He said what Israel is doing is making the world unsafe for Jews, not just in Israel. And I'm not talking about anti-Semitism here.
Absolutely. He's 100% correct. Israel is the Jewish people's worst enemy right now. And I just can't, I just came from a trip. I'm in the south of Greece now, and I just came from a trip to the south of Cyprus. And I went there to do two things: to survey the British military base in Akrotiri, which is funneling huge amounts of weapons to Israel.
Mhm.
And the second thing is I wanted to go to a part of the island called Paphos, which is a town on the coast, southwestern coast of Cyprus, where there were reportedly a very large number of Israelis. And that's exactly what I found. There was a lot of Israelis in the south of Cyprus right now. And there are a lot of Israelis in the south of Greece. We had um, recently one of the real estate companies here in Kalamata, which is not a major tourist destination, was listing its apartments for sale in both English and Hebrew.
Hmm.
So, I
So
mean,
there
what does
you
that?
go. That's it's anecdotal information, but it's still relevant. Obviously, you can't. Your eyes don't lie.
Yeah,
The media
yeah.
does, but your eyes
But
don't.
yeah, there's all kinds of reports about, it is two pieces of information, small pieces of information, but there's all kinds of reports about people fleeing the country, and the economy is taking a terrible hit. They just announced the Israeli government that they were going to uh, have to implement tough, these are the words the media use, tough spending cuts and significant tax increases. That's like the economic kiss of death. Government spending cuts and tax increases at the same time in a country that is already reeling economically.
Mhm.
Uh, how are people going to respond to that? They're going to leave. A lot of people will leave. They'll, if they find that there are greener pastures in the West, and a lot of Israeli Jews have that option, that they can go live in a stable, secure, relatively prosperous Western country.
Yeah. Um, what was I going to say? There was a question I had for you. Well, let's pull back to a wider lens here. There's this word in Hebrew, hasbara. Do you know the word hasbara?
Yeah,
And
basically it's propaganda. It's designed as propaganda, but that's not what it's.
it constantly portrays Israel as the victim, constant,
Right.
constant, constant. Every circumstance is always, oh, yeah, we were defending ourselves. October 7th was self-defense. What we're doing in Lebanon is self-defense. But what I'm getting at is, as a young man growing up, my father worked briefly in Germany. He was a scientist, nuclear scientist, and we went to visit Dachau concentration camp, the site. And I remember, quite young at the time, being just absolutely devastated by this experience because we had these German friends and we thought these are nice people, and some of them were probably old enough to have been in the war, maybe Hitler Youth or whatever, but they were certainly very nice people. And I remember thinking, so I became very fascinated by, the rise of the Nazis and Hitler and how this civilized country of Germany could become so barbaric, and what leads up to this kind of barbarity. My point being is that here's Israel, who is following almost like a blueprint the Germans laid out 75, 80 years ago. Hitler didn't really have a plan. His plan was to just endless war, and looking, as I say, out from Israel more to the broader perspective to include like Ukraine and place Taiwan, whatever. It just seems like we live in a world now where the plan is endless conflict in order to keep people in power, like Netanyahu. Where would he be without this conflict? He probably would have been thrown out already for corruption. But as long as he keeps this war going, and the same goes with American administrations.
Yeah. You know, I keep coming back, in so many of these conversations I have to that incredibly powerful speech that Dwight D. Eisenhower gave at the end of his second term.
Yes.
Um, you know, as many of the people listening to us will know, he warned that the military-industrial complex constituted a grave threat to American democracy. This is coming from a general. This is one of the most storied
And a
figures
Republican.
in a republic. One of the most storied figures in U.S. military history is saying this. And what happened in the 10 years that followed that speech? JFK was assassinated.
Yeah,
RFK was assassinated. Martin Luther King.
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X was assassinated. They escalated the war in Vietnam. And a large part of this, Malcolm, we talk about the role of Zionism and AIPAC and so forth. I think the biggest reason why all of this is happening is because the US government has been hijacked by the military industrial complex. They profit from war. They love this. They absolutely love this. This is fantastic. They have a major war in Ukraine and they have a major war in West Asia that's expanding. They're going to be rolling in the dough. Let the good times roll. This is what these people are saying, and they are in charge. They are in charge. So that to me is the single biggest factor that is driving these wars, is the warning which we failed to heed of Dwight D. Eisenhower at the end of his second term.
I have a very difficult time with certain words, like freedom is one of them. What does that really mean? I mean, freedom in what sense? It's such a ambivalent word. Republicans can use it to say freedom to have guns. Democrats can say freedom to, be a trans person, and whatever. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, our system in America is so reliant on the military industrial, like, our economic system would, I believe, would collapse because you have, little towns in Arizona where the only form of employment is working for some arms manufacturer. Look, I live in Kingston, New York. It's just a hop, skip, and a jump to, Peaceman, Woodstock, New York, just up the road. Do you know what Woodstock, New York's largest form of employment and economic income is? It's a company called Amatech something or other, and it's a well, they if you go to their website, they manufacture refrigeration equipment, but they're actually involved in the military supply chain. And our congressperson, who is a Democrat, even has economic involvement with this company. And it's like every part of our society is so connected to this. It's like, how do you even stop this at this point? That's my question. Like, peace is not profitable. Oh, I think you froze up, Dimitri.
I'm back. I'm sorry about that. That happens. I'm a mountain. So I lost you where you said your congressman might have an interest in this company.
He does. I mean, he does. He doesn't advertise it, but
Right.
if you know anything about our local politics, you'll know that this guy is funded. I mean, he's a Democrat, but he advertises himself as former combat veteran, and on one of his campaign flyers, he's actually holding a weapon. This is a Democrat, and again, there's this old Gilbert and Sullivan play, Topsy Turvy, one of those British musicals from the 19th century where everything's just upside down. this,
Yeah.
this seems like, I don't mean to laugh, like it's not funny.
By the
It's
way, did you see or hear that Kamala Harris, in her interview, her so-called interview with Oprah Winfrey, said, "I have a gun, and if anybody breaks into my house, they're going to get shot." So this this is not confined to your local Democrat,
no,
Mel.
I watched an interview. Chris had just had a guy named Jimmy Dore on his show, and Jimmy had been at the Democratic National Convention, as a commentator. And, it's like 25, 30,000 people in a stadium. And Kamala's talking about, we're going to, toughen up against Russia, and we're going to, arm up. And they're all cheering, yay, 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 war, war, war. And then he was at a Trump rally. Now, I'm not supporting Trump in any way, shape, or form here. Neither of these people are interesting to me. But Trump's there saying, we need to come to an agreement with Russia and stop this. I could make a phone call tomorrow and call up, Zelensky and Putin, and this would be over. And it's probably true. And the crowd of Republicans is cheering for ending war. And I'm like, hello, what? Like, how
Yeah.
did?
In my opinion, Malcolm, the single most important, and by the way, I totally agree with you about Trump. Okay, let me be very, very clear here. I have no time whatsoever for either of these characters.
Uh,
The single most important thing, in my opinion, that was said in the debate between him and Kamala Harris was said by him. And it was a true statement. And he said it, I think, at least twice, if not three times. And the statement was Russia has a nuclear arsenal. It's a simple, undeniable fact. And nobody paid any attention to it. The moderators, Kamala ignored it. The press reported didn't report on it. So we are in truly bizarro world when the likes of Donald Trump has become the leading advocate for peace in the Republican and Democratic Party. But to go back to your original point about the economy, I recently interviewed Vijay Prashad from the Tricontinental Institute, and he and some colleagues did an analysis of U.S. spending. And they drilled down and they came to the conclusion that US military spending, direct and indirect, is not the official number of 800 to 900 billion. I think it's now approaching 900 billion, but it's 1.5 trillion
sounds more like it.
dollars.
Yeah, sounds more like it.
So would it collapse the US economy, as you suggested, if that money were withdrawn? Of course it would. $1.5 trillion a year. The US economy is basically it completely depends on life support from military spending at this stage. It's been deindustrialized. The only part that's really industrialized at this point is the military sector, with some small exceptions. So, how do you get out of this mess? I don't know. How do you turn the United States into a peace-loving state when the very existence of its economy depends upon war spending? It's a tremendous challenge.
Well, if one were to take, again, referring to Chris Hedges, the more sober, bleak, realist view that he holds, there is no fixing it. This is, he always makes these analogies to like empires in decline. He'll talk about the Roman Empire and how they end up at this sort of tipping point where it can't sustain itself because it's just, the weight on top is just too heavy. And Sheldon Wallen, the great political philosopher, has described our system as what he calls inverted totalitarianism. So it's, imagine upside down pyramid where all control of media, government, and the economy is all controlled from a very small number of points in the system, and it just collapses inwards. And I hate to say it, but I think that's kind of where it's going to go. Like, it's terrible to think that would be the end result. But and then of course you have countries like China, the economic engine of the world practically at this point. I wanted to ask you one last thing before I let you go, and that is, and I think we touched on this last time we spoke, because it was shortly after this debacle in the Canadian Parliament where they had
Which
this,
one?
yeah,
There's
well,
so
the one where Yaroslav Hunka, this
Oh yes, yes.
former Nazi from Ukraine, was like brought to the parliament and they were cheering, 16 standing ovations. And then all of a sudden it's like, Trudeau's like, oops, I wasn't I didn't invite the guy. It was this other guy. Fire him.
Right.
Can we just focus a little bit on Canada's? I mean, you and I both know that there's this, again, myth. The Canadian myth is that we're the good guys. The Lester B. Pearson sort of, we're the negotiators. Trudeau, the older, the negotiator. We're the good guys. Come on, let's debunk that myth just a little bit here, please.
Oh God, it's such a ridiculous myth. The Yaroslav Hunka scandal. Excuse me, I have a cat here who's making a lot of noise. So Forgive me that she's acting up.
Uh,
Um,
Cats.
this provoked a big debate. It reopened a debate around the hundreds and I think it's actually thousands of Nazis who came into Canada in the aftermath of the Second World War. And during the elder Trudeau's time, as you probably know, Malcolm, there was a commission, public inquiry into this. It was called the Deschênes Commission, I believe.
Hmm.
And Trudeau ended up ordering the redaction of large portions of this report. So the Yaroslav Hunka scandal has caused the government to reconsider the redactions. And a report appeared in the press recently by, I think it was David Pugliese at the Ottawa Citizen, which is a mainstream newspaper,
Hmm.
um, where he received the information was leaked to him about the internal deliberations around releasing the full report. And some of the stuff that was said was just wild. So there were concerns that this might cause people, Ukrainian Nazis who had committed war crimes and come to Canada, to be prosecuted. This was being floated as a reason not to release the
Hmm.
report.
Hmm.
Uh, I thought that Canada would be the kind of place where you would prosecute
This is
Nazis who
what.
committed war crimes. And another reason that was given was that it might embarrass the Ukrainian community.
Hmm.
If anything's going to embarrass the Ukrainian community, I would have thought it's suppressing the names of people who, collaborated with the Nazis and then came to Canada. If the Canadian public thinks that they're the right wing, certainly there are people in the Ukrainian community who are appalled by this, but the right wing of the Ukrainian community in Canada, which is the part of the community that the Canadian government listens to, they ignore the other part. They don't even acknowledge their existence. Um, if they prevail in this debate and they are perceived by Canadians to be suppressing the names of Nazis who came from Ukraine because they don't want to be embarrassed, I think they're going to end up alienating a lot of Canadians,
Mhm.
especially people from the Jewish community, and rightly so. So uh, I think this, in a way, this is inappropriate language, but this Yaroslav Hunka thing is kind of like the gift that keeps on giving because it's exposing what this country really is.
Yeah.
It ain't no honest broker. It's not a beacon of morality and human rights. Quite the contrary.
But yet, and I say this as a fellow Canadian, and I love Canada. It's a beautiful country. People always go, "Oh, I've been to Canada. It's so nice there," but people are so, I don't know if the word, it's not gullible, right? That isn't really the right term, but there's this sort of prevailing, I call it the CVC mentality, that we're Canada, blah blah blah. The worst thing we can talk about is the Conservative Party, or
Yeah.
whatever, or how much people hate Trudeau or whatever. But there's this naivety that we couldn't possibly be involved in any nefariousness.
Yeah. But I think, a lot of this has to do with geography. So you just have to look at a map. So on, the eastern side of Canada, you have this massive ocean. And on the western side of Canada, you have an even bigger ocean. You got a big, damn cold, icy ocean in the north. We have a border on one country, and something like 80%, which is, of course, the United States, and 80% of the population, if not more, lives within 100 miles of the US border.
Yeah.
And we are constantly bombarded with US propaganda, constantly. So what does this mean? That means, first of all, we're very heavily under the influence of that propaganda model, which is, in my opinion, the most sophisticated, effective propaganda model in the history of humanity. Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman described it brilliantly, how it operates. And it's truly a work of art from a propagandist's perspective. But the other thing is, it's not easy for Canadians to interact with people outside the country. It's a bit of a challenge. We are a wealthy country and people can travel, but it's not like you can get in your car. If you live in like France, you can get in your car and you can drive to Belgium, Switzerland,
Yeah.
Italy,
Sure.
Austria. It's just like a few hours. Canadians can't do that. They have to get in a plane and travel across an ocean. And so this results, all of this, in us having a very insular mentality.
Mhm.
We live in a bubble. And that bubble is heavily influenced by the US propaganda system. So this is why I find the lack of sophistication amongst Canadians about their real place in the world and how they actually stack up to other societies and what is actually happening in places far afield. The lack of sophistication is shocking to me, absolutely shocking. I've lived in the United States, I've lived in France, I spent a lot of time in Greece, I lived in Australia for a while. I've never seen anything like the insularity of the Canadian mind.
Well, that's what
Uh,
I'm sort of saying. I grew up in a small town in not northern Ontario, but a few hours north of Ottawa, and it's just like to this day, it's like to me, it's like the Stepford Wives. It's like Fantasyland. People are just sort of in this little world. I mean, this is
it's
not an
Stepford wise.
indictment.
That's an excellent metaphor. Absolutely. That's the way I feel oftentimes when I go back to Canada, Malcolm. 100%.
Uh, This isn't an indictment of my friends in my hometown of Deep River, but I remember one time I was having a conversation with one of the neighbors about climate change. This was like 20 years ago, and he's like, climate change is great. It'll be more time at the cottage. It's like, come on, man. Like, let's get real here. You know,
I bet you
um,
there are a lot of Canadians who think like that. Unfortunately, I've encountered a few myself.
and
So
it's not unusual to see people with like a Trump thing on their F-150s driving down the Highway 17, and
yeah,
and then there's this sort of goody two shoes sort of mentality and they're nice people, they're good people, but they just are, as you say, so you just want to smack them, like, hey, wake up, you know,
they're very unaware. They're very unaware.
willfully so. That's the trouble.
And
Many.
I want to say, I think the Canadian media uh, takes full advantage of these sort of geographical peculiarities. I think at a certain level, they understand that Canadians are very, very reliant upon them for their understanding of where the world is
Mm,
at, what's happening. And they also understand that the vast majority of Canadians aren't going to go to these places and see for themselves. They're not going to go to Lebanon, unless you're Lebanese, you have family there.
mm,
What Canadians are going to travel to Lebanon and see for themselves what's happening there, or Syria, or Ukraine, or, Russia? All of the places right now where there's conflict happening. Uh, the vast majority of Canadians will never visit these places, have never visited these places. They rely entirely on the corporate media, which is dominated by US narratives. And they take full advantage of this. They just lie shamelessly about the corporate media in Canada, lie shamelessly about foreign affairs. It's mind blowing what they get away with. Some of
mm.
the ludicrous things that they say with a straight
Oh,
face.
I used to be one of these people who would, I had the CBC Listen app on my phone. I just like, oh, I want to hear, what's going on up there. And, I tune into CBC Montreal or Ottawa or whatever the station was. I had to stop because I was just like, this is just nonsense. Like, I couldn't take it anymore. It's like,
An
seeing
insult
this.
to our intelligence. It really is. It's, for those of us who've actually traveled a bit and seen these places and can ascertain for ourselves what's happening. Like I see what they write about Lebanon, and I'm just like, you people are you that dishonest or are you that clueless? I don't
I
know.
think they're just, I mean, I have to say, I got to think they're clueless. But on the other hand, some of the media moguls in Canada, as you're fully aware of, are, you know, hand in glove with the American interests. And so, that's where they get their marching orders from. So, anyway, well, my friend, I've kept you for almost an hour and I really do appreciate it. Is there anything before you go that you'd like to talk about or mention or leave us with?
Well, I'm working on Jill Stein's campaign,
Oh, good.
so I give her two hearty thumbs up, and if there's any way in which you can support Jill Stein's campaign, absolutely, baby.
One on the
100%.
bumper,
Yes. I don't have one of those. I need to get one of those. Anyways,
the
uh,
t-shirt too. It doesn't even have her face on it. It just has something written on it. It's a green t-shirt with just some positive thing written on it, as opposed to like, hey, look at me.
yeah. And so, of course, it would be her winning the presidential election would be miraculous. Anybody who's not from the Democratic or Republican Party winning the U.S. election would be miraculous. But if she even gets like 5 or 6% of the vote, that would be a powerful,
Well,
powerful
this
statement.
is the aim. This is the aim.
Yeah. So your vote would count, even if she doesn't win. And we all know that's going to be an extremely difficult task. The more votes she gets, the more the U.S. political elite will have to stand up and take notice.
Well, I do not know. I don't know if you're familiar with a YouTube. Her name's Joy Brianna Gray. She used to be
Yes, I
one
am.
of. Anyway, she's really great, and I really enjoy listening to her. She's very sensible and doesn't get into the hysterics of things. And she was talking to. I think she interviewed Jill Stein a few times, but anyway, she was saying, debunking this myth that if you vote for the accusation is always if you vote for Jill Stein, you might as well be voting for Donald Trump. It'll be your fault. They always say that. They said that about Ralph Nader years ago. It's the endless thing. But what they were saying was like if you live in a blue state, like New York is never going to go Republican. I mean, cows would fly before that would happen. So it's not about the popular vote, right? It's about the electoral college. So New York is always going to go for the Democrats. Texas is always going to go for the Republicans. Arizona is always going to, there's only like 7 swing states. So she's saying like if you live in a true like a true blue or a red state, you can without any conscious, you don't have to compromise your moral conscience, whatever. You can vote for Jill Stein. Let's just get her to 5%.
Mhm.
Of course, if you lived in Michigan or one of the other swing states, that may be a different choice, right? But I don't. Most Americans don't either. So,
Mhm. Look,
um,
I would say I would add also, Malcolm, this may be controversial, but I'm not at all convinced that Kamala Harris is a less heinous option than Donald Trump. I think they're both heinous options. On the one hand, he's at least talking about stopping the Ukraine war, which could end up getting us all killed in a nuclear conflagration. She seems to have zero interest in doing that. So, you got that going for him, which is a big point in his favor. On the other hand, she supports women's reproductive rights, which is a big point in her favor. But is she actually going to do anything at the end of the day to protect them? That is an open question. Will she be able to do anything to protect them? And what matters more to you, having a federal law? Because there are states that are still protecting reproductive rights at the state level. Do you want a federal law that protects women's reproductive rights, which maybe she'll get, and which is undoubtedly very important? Or do you want to avoid a nuclear war? With Russia. These are very, very difficult questions. And so when I add it all up, I'm like, I don't see that one is actually, less awful than the other. They're both horrible candidates. And the only way you're ever going to hold these people to account is by not voting for either of them.
yeah,
So
they
you have
don't.
to send them a message. They
Well,
can't count.
a lot of blacks, and certainly in the Muslim community now in the United States, very strong uncommitted movement. Michigan, to in particular, uh, has disavowed itself from the Democratic Party because it feels that no longer is working in their interests. I mean, they see what's happening in Gaza. They see what's happening, and they're like, well, that's not the Republicans that are doing this. This is the Democrat. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, as who was it? Somebody once said, "Would you prefer a gun to the head or a knife in the throat?" That's your choice.
But either way. Yeah.
There's your cat. Well, it's
Yeah.
always good talking to you. I
It's
just
also
feel like it's like just hanging out with a friend, and that's my favorite.
how I feel
I
done.
really hope one of these days we actually get to sit down together and have some olives and a glass of wine together.
Well, as the other half of the year I spend in Montreal, so I'm going to, sorry.
Well, next
Um,
time you're in Montreal, let me know because
well, I
it's
want to drive down and see you in New York State. And there's a big peace thing going on with Scott Ritter, I think, in your neck of the woods, isn't there?
that's actually this coming Saturday. I'm somewhat involved in that. Um, I,
Hmm.
I know Scott quite well, and he asked me for a couple of pieces of music of mine that I had written. In particular, there's one that I actually sent you called "Destroyer of Worlds," where I used the JFK peace speech, and then I used the snippets of Vladimir Putin's famous 2007 Munich speech, and then at the end of the piece, there's Oppenheimer saying, when we saw this, we all agreed that I have now become death, the destroyer of worlds. So anyway, they're going to use a couple of my bits, and I'll be there.
Great. Well, I'm sorry, I won't be there for that, but I am going to come and visit you in New York State as soon as
Well,
I
give me
get
a
a
heads
minute.
up. You know what? I don't know if you can see it. It's a nice house here. If you need somewhere to stay, there's always a
Whatever.
room or whatever. But just to get to share some time together. So, meantime, be
Okay.
safe. I know you're doing a lot of traveling, and some of the places you're going are, you know, just got to
Yeah, appreciate that.
keep your you know keep your wits about you, as I say. All right.
Thank you. Take
Cheers.
care.
Peace, brother.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Peace, bro. Bye.
Bye.